Hello everyone, today we talk about the transformation of civil institutions and social structures into the western half of the Roman Empire. Actually, we will look both at, say, the late antique period and a bit of early medieval times. And recently we discussed on Schwerpunkt rather extensively about the Eastern Roman Empire, especially the reasons that brought to the shift of the core of the Roman imperial power on the Bosphorus, and partly also the broader political and social transformations into the Roman East. So today I thought to concentrate instead on the Pars Occidentis, in fact, and we will mostly deal actually with the European provinces. We will leave Africa a little bit for another video. And this is not going to be actually a political and military history. So it's obvious that at this point there is this massive eruption of the Germanic populations within the borders of the empire, and this triggered so many transformations. We will mostly look at the social dimension of this, and more specifically also we will deal partly also with the so-called Bacaude, or Bacaudae, how you want to pronounce from the ecclesiastical or restituta pronunciation. But overall we'll mostly deal with the civil transformations. There are not that naturally also have to deal with partly with dealt in part with say strategical reasons, also military organization, etc., but that's not the core. If you're interested specifically about the say the strictly military dimension of this time, if you're going to the migration era playlist, I've actually discussed, especially recently, a lot about the Franks, especially, and about a late Roman Gaul. So the relation between the Franks, the Gallo-Roman society. So that's the one I've discussed more in detail. And then I've extensively discussed also about the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Longobards. So if you really want to look at the history of those peoples, just go look into Migration Era playlist, and I'm sure you can find something that can be interesting for you. Today we go mostly with this broader general topic of the whole western half of the empire. So one thing we have to start with by introducing especially the Bacaude is observing that in the previous centuries to the crisis of the West, the even the very deep Romanization of certain areas of the empire had not basically eliminated the ethno-cultural background, or how you want to call it, the substratum substantially that existed from the previous from pre-Roman times. And this happened mostly, I mean, I don't know, sometimes we have this idea the Roman Empire was this extremely impositive power that dealt so much in depth with the organization and with the living of these populations, but this is not really true. I mean, the Roman Empire was in fact an empire. It was a military presence over enormous territories of the ancient world that were, however, left mostly to organize themselves on their own, as long as they were pacific, so that they didn't create problems to trade and the collection of taxes. Everything was practically fine. I mean, the Romans didn't have any reason to commit resources into the the subjugation of populations that were essentially doing nothing subversive towards the Roman rule. But this at the same time brought towards the end of the empire of the revival of certain identities, but also this is a bit more complex. It is a bit really more and in part also difficult to really reconstruct historically speaking, because we have a very few sources about this. of the let's say of the local revival, yeah, we can say of the local identities, but more than else, this was a sort of autonomization of the local communities given the broader political and military crisis of the empire at this time. Romanization had invested especially through the great cities, the great centers that in part already existed in the West. The West had seen the Hellenic colonization back in the day, the Celts that were the dominating ethnicity into Western Europe before the Roman conquest were really hadn't reached a stage of urbanization, of urbanism proper, but they had began to develop these fortified centers called oppida that were essentially the prelude and also the base for the later of urbanization. The Romans built essentially over the same Celtic centers and roads and so on, so they basically exploited, just like any other people at the time, the same infrastructures that already existed before, with the only difference that the Romans, of course, had a much more advanced level of urbanization, and they rebuilt these cities from scratch. This was a copy of Rome. I mean, every single Roman colony had to be essentially the same copy of Rome, with the forum, with the games, I mean, the aqueducts, etc. So you find sometimes even in regions that were a bit on the outskirts of the empire. If you take North Africa, for instance, where maybe large cities could not be sustained by the local economy, but still the centers built by the Romans were these small Roman cities built in miniature with everything really of the aforementioned objects. Excuse me, I drink a little bit more. I know I'm introducing this badly, but try to make it. And so the city had been a bit the cornerstone of the Roman domination, whereas the countryside had remained largely, even after, I don't know, half of a millennium of Roman domination, relatively detached from this process of Romanization, etc. However, the countryside, especially in the well, we can say at all times, was naturally the seat of these huge Roman latifundia. The Romans were always governed essentially by an oligarchy, and this oligarchy was of senatorial origin, and it had taken roots into the Roman provinces, owning these extremely large estates that essentially were the base for the same development eventually of the Roman cities, as naturally the agricultural surplus at this point was the core of economy, and even if trade was very important, however, without this latifundia, the Romans could have never built their own cities, etc. So the regions of the Western Roman Empire had been usually very fertile. Italy was one of the most fertile places of the ancient world. Gaul had huge agricultural resources. Central and southern Spain were definitely also extremely fertile, especially southern Spain. There were other areas, even certain parts of Germany were fertile enough, especially along the Rhine and especially in the so-called agri decumates. So in the southwest of Germany, they were arguably the only place that was fertile enough to host Romanization in practice. Well, these weren't excessively fertile. Let's say that the core was definitely central and southern Italy, central and southern Gaul, and central and southern Spain. The rest, also for climatic reasons, was naturally a bit different, but you can argue that wherever the Romans expanded, it's because there was enough agricultural resources that could sustain the Roman model of colonization. So this is also how the political geography of the empire was dictated by. It's not that the Romans couldn't invade regions like, I don't know, Germany or Scotland, or but simply these were too, in terms ratio cost benefits, these were totally unworthy, and the Romans had to figure that out, and they tried also to to include these domains in their empire, but they saw at a certain point, this is not really worth it, because the populations are not receptive, they don't want to be Romanized, there's no, the area is too primitive, we can't basically penetrate commercially in here, and therefore they preferred to let them out. Albeit the Romans had controlled, in this sense, also these same populations through sheer deterrence, and this is also something that is often overlooked, that the Roman Empire didn't have a proper border, a linear border in this sense. There were at best certain very large areas of frontier that the Romans still controlled by deploying their legions on the, in fact, these often natural borders like the Rhine, the Danube, etc. But anyhow, this is not important. What is rather important is that also in the countryside, in the Roman West, just like in the East, by the way, but the West was a bit different given the previous populations that inhabited there. So the rise of these enormously large estates that in the West, in fact, did not exist before the Roman conquest. The late Iron Age had other forms of land exploitation. In the East, the Romans kind of found already enormously large estates that had belonged to the Hellenistic kings, etc., that were kind of eventually, and also that were created in largely civilized areas. In the West, the Romans had done arguably most of the job, because they, from a certain point of view, was also kind of advantageous, because they kind of reshaped the political and economical geography by through their models of colonization. However, next to these large patronal villas, there were communities that were, as we've seen, substantially not Romanized. They interacted with the Romans, of course. They were part of the empire. They paid their share of tribute, they paid taxes, etc., but that had remained largely free. Certain rural areas, and especially the more forested and mountainous areas, had remained substantially untouched by the Roman domination. Even in places like Gaul or Spain, that remained for half of a millennium, in fact, under the Roman domination. And especially, in fact, in these regions of Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula, the Celtic element had remained very strong, and and even the language had remained kind of had remained preserved in part. You know that the Roman Empire, among the other things, brought to a sort of to the death of many, first of all, of many peoples, objectively, because there were some tribes that were kind of wiped out. But secondly, there was a sort of cultural flattening that happened in a much less brutal way, but by sheer osmosis, as many of these populations began to speak kind of a Romance language in part. I mean, at this time, obviously, there was still a stricter differentiation between Latin and the various languages that were spoken in here, but let's say that many communities, having been Romanized, began to speak Latin on their own. That's the reason why in today's France they speak a Romance language and not a Celtic one. So this gives naturally an important, gives an idea of how Romanization had been important. telling the truth, this process is a bit more complicated in the sense that also in here it would be interesting to know how the local communities actually spoke, because they surely didn't all speak Latin, and even what they began to speak is sometimes maybe something that took much longer, especially in Roman times. Strictly the tongue that was spoken was probably more differentiated. Then it's also a matter of the elites. What do the elites speak essentially? And but I don't want to get into this because I don't have the necessary competence. But just for saying that large areas remained speaking, they kind of absorbed part of the Latin speaking, or whatever it was. By the way, Celtic and Italic are extremely close. So even in here, this great difference between the Romans and the Celts is actually a 19th century positivistic myth, and has nothing, shouldn't be stressed. Really, these were regions that were quite close in origin, also culturally speaking, much more than it's often said. Just recently I made a video that deals with the totemic animals into the Celtic world, chiefly the Gaulish one that is the best documented, and incidentally the one that in fact was more Romanized eventually in the Celtic world. It's called I think Celtic totemic animals, as simply as that. And I discuss incidentally also this part of how for instance, the local Celtic deities were kind of Romanized, and how they were worshipped with characters that were essentially an hybrid between the pre-Roman and Roman tradition, practically. So this is not really the point of the video, but let's say that there was a difference between these more Romanized areas, especially the ones gravitating around the big cities of Gaul, of Spain. Spain is a bit more complicated because it had been heavily Celticized, especially in the north, but the south was much more multi-ethnic. It had seen there were Greek, Phoenician influences over this Iberian stratus that wasn't, especially in the south, much Celticized actually. Then the Romans came, so it was and then eventually the Germans. So you can imagine how this whole thing blended into something very original. And the pity is we have a very few sources actually about the processes of even linguistical transformation at this time. And you have to think in a period like the Roman domination, like half of a millennium, how much a society can change in practice. Then, especially at this point of the late antique or medieval times, there were certain upheavals that brought even to the there was definitely an economical contraction, an academic contraction as well, new invasions, so new ethnicities that were brought in. Certain areas that remained, in fact, more detached from these processes, and this is incidentally the ones from which, essentially from the end of the 3rd century, so with the crisis of the famous crisis of the 3rd century, came to produce the so-called Bacaude Revolts. So the Bacaude, or Bagaude, or Bacaudai, or Bagaudai, depending on how you wanna call them. You know that this is a Latin term, is the Latinization of a seemingly a Celtic term, whose etymology is uncertain, but it probably means fighter, something like that. And people say, oh well, these were actually Celts that were rebelling against the Romans. This is not really true. These were definitely communities that, as we've seen, came from some of the least Romanized areas of this region. But it's a bit difficult to say, okay, these were Celts proper. And even certain processes that occurred later, like the emigration of certain allegedly Celtic populations from regions like Cornwall or other regions of Britain when the Anglo-Saxons invaded into Brittany, so into northern France, is sometimes said, well, these were actually Celts. Well, this is not really true. I mean, after, of course, these were dominantly Celtic populations of Celtic stock, but also in here the term Celtic can define something very different from what it was the ancient Celtic, say, pre-Roman identity. These were usually heavily transformed populations. I can't say heavily Romanized, because especially in regions like, in fact, of certain areas of Britain or certain areas of Gaul, Spain, this heavy Romanization had not taken place, but still it had transformed these populations in a way that had not to do with those same, say, Celtic origin. Also because the ancient Celtic tribes also in here did not exist anymore as such. I mean, even socially speaking, these were groups that had started to live in very different fashions. They had enjoyed the advantages of sedentarization, of urbanization. They had heavily interfered, let's say, interacted, let's say, better, not interfered with the Roman authorities. So whichever they weren't really, you have to think of a late Iron Age Celt that after 500 years one woke up and started to behave the same way. These weren't like that. So these Bacaude in part were definitely also Romanized. These were peasants most of the times. This is also important to stress. Some of these Bacaude actually came from the same Roman latifundia, or to these, say, from lands that had entered into this broader circuit of the Roman economy in the area, and they were in fact allegedly of Celtic stock. I mean, yeah, these were regions that had been Celts before, so they were essentially, ethnically speaking, something, if not the same thing, something very similar, but still very socially different. And in fact, even around the same term of Bacaude, we don't know more than much. It seems a Celtic-derived word, but also in here it's just a name. We don't have to think this identified as scientific category. We have not been there. We don't know how it was. We have too few informations, and that's pretty much what we have to be content with, and not stressing too many further meanings. Also because probably these movements, as we will see now, were started for reasons that had many reasons more than just, freeing themselves from a Roman domination. These were revolts that, by the way, happened several times, even periodically, sometimes during the 4th and 5th century. So what was the root of the revolt? What was the triggering factor? Well, essentially there were a couple. The first one was this ethnic origin that was at least allegedly let's say claimed as the differentiating character of these groups from the Roman domination. So it was quite convenient in this context to stress some kind of a different identity from whom, by the way, because the same Romans had partly Celticized. I mean, the Gallo-Roman society in here was something, in fact, more. They were not Italians, for instance. They at this point they were a fusion between there's Romans and the Gauls, as the local aristocracies had blended in, had given origin also in here. The local, at a certain point, the Romans integrated these Gallic elites also in the Senate, etc. So the myth that these were Celts fighting against the Romans, what's really the point? It's not. This was allegedly claimed, but this wasn't really the main problem. The main problem actually was the social condition of these people and the bond they had with the land, that especially from the very 3rd century had began to make them sensibly worsen their living condition. So there was a very important socio-economical reasons for this. So these were populations that had begun to suffer because of the political instability, of the military invasions, the economical crisis, and they felt themselves to be exploited essentially in the Roman estates, in this Roman economy that was becoming increasingly more demanding also in terms of taxation and so on. Then there was also another important factor that perhaps is overlooked, is that the spread of Christianity to these areas, because Christianism was at this point interpreted like a sort of egalitarian doctrine, as in front of God every man is equal substantially, and therefore it was bringing a sort of socially revolutionary message. So that if you this happened also in our time. I mean, the idea that the masses at this point were feeling comforted by the Christian message after all the sufferings, after all the problems that were occurring into the empire, so that Christianity was giving them an answer, and at the same time was stressing something new, that is the equality of every person. So this, together with a bit a local identity, was a bit different also on a communitary and identitary base. Social conditions that were sensibly worsening was bringing these people to essentially rebel the social order as it had been built by the Roman Empire. Roman Empire, especially at this point, was not already Christian, as the fact that this would come during the 4th century and very progressively so. But also this one was an excuse. I mean, these rebellions would have taken place even if the Roman Empire had been already Christian at that point. It was mostly a social problem. This is how, at least how I interpret it. And so just imagine also what the situation was. These events, these revolts took place chiefly in Gaul, and Gaul at this point was being invaded by the Germanic populations that were pushing from the east, who either ravaged the area and left for other lands, either they were essentially settling into the lands of this this Gallic population, or say Gallo-Roman population, and who and these populations didn't also want to curb themselves to these increased oppression that was coming on a local base, with the concentration of all the management of the local economy and society at the hands of the masters of the say the senatorial class. So the owners of these large estates that were progressively eroding the properties of the middle class that at this point was in crisis, and it was slowly absorbing these freemen and making them essentially transform into serfs, de facto, as at this point, by the way, almost all the citizens of the empire were, all the people dwelling in the empire had become citizens de facto, but this the whole social, the whole ether of Romanization now had almost become meaningless from a civil point of view, as the functioning of the integration of the civil duties and service that eventually broke to the citizenship basically didn't work anymore. The crisis had kicked in. The Roman society was changing rapidly. The whole mechanism had kind of broken down. So at this point, the real thing was becoming, rather than citizens, subjects, when not serfs, especially when you take into considerations these small, medium landowners. I mean, the huge countrysides of the empire were progressively now losing their contractual power. They were getting impoverished by wars, by that entailed not just the devastations but also the military service that was quite demanding. So the typical crises that occur, also famines, plague, etc. And sometimes we will see it, especially later. They tended, these people tended to become eventually to agree, essentially, through contract, by the way, to become colonists for the and working in these very harsh conditions into the Roman latifundia, because those had become the latifundia of the great senatorial elites that had become basically the only place that still functioned at a, you know, as a production system, let's say, and that could offer them job and also protection, and in turn, however, losing part of their freedom. And if you're interested especially about this, if you go into the medieval society playlist of Schwerpunkt, there is a video that deals essentially with the transformation. Yeah, here it is. From the late antique villa to the early medieval curtis. That is a bit of an explanation how Roman society basically transformed into the medieval one through this process in the countryside. So into a space that is often overlooked, because most of the decline of the Roman Empire is often thought to be the cries of the cities, of this great, I say, of trade, this mostly urban dimension. But telling you the truth, that came because the same urban centers depended heavily on what was happening to the countryside. So you have to understand that as the countryside was the base of the production of every pre-industrial society, and the major transformations occurred there. And it's very interesting because there are also many other considerations you can do. I mean, for instance, how the Roman clienteles transformed but also survived into the Middle Ages, and they blended with the Germanic ones, and they gave origin to something. And Gaul especially is the most important a region that to which this process occurs. If you look in the medieval France playlist, if you're interested especially about Gaul, I discussed that. There is also the video about the Frankish Commendatio that is quite that it's a bit more about the early medieval times rather than the late antique, but it kind of deals also with the origins of the Frankish clienteles into Gallo-Frankish clienteles into the Gallo-Roman times. So just for saying, it's today, I don't know why I explained so poorly. I don't know, probably because I didn't repeat much enough. My my how do you call that, sketches for the video. However, so the Bacaude were choosing in front of this, instead of accepting these transformations that evidently were pretty perceived as very negative, as a symptom of crisis, as a the subvertment of a world, of a society that otherwise up to that point had substantially functioned. They chose the way of the, let's say, of the armed protest. So to say that at least in a romantic way, because telling the truth, the reality was much worse in practice, as most of these Bacaude were just brigands, let's be honest about it. But it's still, probably it is their background was not devoid of other reasons, as we've seen. Also this so strong opposition to the process of I don't know how to say, of enslavement, of subjugation of freemen, was something that in societies that were used to the ideal freemen, like the one of the Celtic world, where it was rather egalitarian, relatively egalitarian, was felt as something that couldn't be accepted, also ethically speaking. But this was not just a matter of ideals, this was a matter of really seeing your society was crumbling in many ways and refusing this change, refusing let's say the exactions, the oppressions that were objectively taking place. Also because the Roman administration was not tender at all, and in this process, especially think about with the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, the Roman state was now becoming more pervasive into the Roman society. So it was basically obliging all the Roman subjects to behave in a certain way, to be obliged to be framed in a certain district, to start working in certain activities that they couldn't escape from. Many of these jobs began to become hereditary, and most of them were definitely being a peasant, a colonist. So there were many people who felt that it was an imposition to their own freedom, and a restriction that they didn't want to undergo. So especially in these least Romanized lands, this was perceived as a very good chance to revolt. And however, the main problem, and this is just a speculation in part, in the sense that most of the times what the hell is this Facebook messages from my oh, whatever. I was keep talking about myself. I mean, the development and especially the results of such revolts are not always clear. So sometimes there are differentiations on a geographical base. For instance, around the mid 5th century, in the region of Armorica, there was a very serious revolt of the Bacaude. You know that Armorica is substantially today's Brittany, Bretagne in northern France. So this area is very exemplar because it was one of the least Romanized corners of the empire. Armorica is the one when you find Asterix, for instance, and then it was perceived, in fact, as this last outpost from the Roman domination. And indeed, it was a region was so wild and so poor that, historically speaking, produced, by the way, very warlike communities. So you find here Back in the day, they were surely not a match for the Romans, and in fact, up to this point, Armonica had remained kind of fine. But in fact, you see, in the 5th century, the revolts of the Bacaude. During the Carolingian Empire, the Bretons always rebelling. During the Middle Ages, Bretagne kind of remained, even with the Kingdom of France was a huge thing, extremely powerful, kind of remained always on its own. During the French Revolution, think about the Vendeans. There's always these same areas. This was dictated mostly by environmental reasons, because this was in fact, a wild land where it was difficult also to penetrate economically, and it had remained a bit on its own. Like northern Spain, like other areas of, the Celtic fringe eventually into Britain. The reason is arguably always the same, and this is also why these regions were the ones where the Celtic language kind of remained more, and fortunately we can still study it now. Unfortunately, the Celtic languages are dying out, but it's because these were kind of at the outskirts of other regions, were more fertile, more that could serve for the development of a more developed society, and therefore the invaders of these areas, it doesn't matter who they were, it had been the Romans, had been the Germans, kind of preferred to stay in those more fertile lands and kind of leave these other ones out, because there was no benefit from spending resources to conquer them. And this is interesting also geographically speaking, because you realize that this was not a matter of geographical distance. It was really, you could find these wild areas also relatively close to very important developed centers. And this is not just, Armonica in this sense is a macro region, but if you go all over Europe, you realize that even a few tens of kilometers away from enormous centers, maybe there are regions that are, especially in the mountains, etc., that are more kind of on their own. That's simply because there had been no economical penetration in there, so nobody actually cared to do something that didn't have to do with this strictly economical thing, because actually it's always about money. Arguably, empires do not expand themselves for the sake of empty glory. They just search places that make them gain a lot of money. So in the mid 5th century, the Bacaude of Armonica rebelled, choosing as a mediator in Rome the bishop Germain of Auxerre, who would become in fact Saint-Germain eventually. This is interesting because the Bacaude in this episode in this instance asked for a kind of an institutional interlocutor. At this time, bishops were, by the way, very rising to be very prominent as political figures. Especially Gaul was arguably the place where the church had the greatest power, economically speaking. The Gallo-Roman elites at this point were a fusion between the senatorial classes and the episcopal one, that were often the same thing, because also the Roman senators eventually converted to Christianity, and so extremely convenient to in fact begin to manage these extremely wealthy dioceses and monasteries, and Gaul is the perfect synthesis of that. Gaul arguably is the perfect synthesis eventually also later between these Gallo-Roman Germanic society. And because you see, Gaul had remained kind of untouched from the major destructions that occurred into other regions, so this extremely fertile area managed to absorb so many elements at once to make them coexist, because it was understood that through this coexistence a collective benefit could be obtained. But still, the Bacaude, in this sense, belonged to the outer world of this. Even if they were in the same Gaul, geographically speaking, they belonged to a very different and diverse society. And this episode is important because it shows that these populations still, however, understood the importance of the empire and recognized its authority in this moment of great distress, also because this is exactly, by the way, the moment into which the Alani had poured into Gaul and were devastating. So they were still hoping for the Roman authority to help them, because this is also how it had been, arguably. We said it before. I mean, the Romans had come essentially as a military force. Eventually, these regions had urbanized and, they had kind of civilized and kind of converted to the Roman ways, Roman lifestyle, but they still perceive themselves as local communities. And this is very important because in terms of Roman political identity, and political propaganda, the diversity of the various provinces of the empire was actually stressed. I mean, in the ancient world, these guys were not really running for becoming Romans, for pursuing their career so that they could fake themselves as, I don't know, Italic. These people were, wherever they came from, were extremely proud to say, I am, I don't know, Gallic in origin, but I am a Roman citizen. So this was the greatness of Rome. I mean, the idea that the Roman identity, and in fact has nothing national, the Roman identity is merely political. It has nothing to do with that. The Romans were Italic in identity originally. They weren't Roman in identity. Roman is just the citizenship you get. I mean, it's just like a passport you get to enter into into this system of the Roman Empire. But you bring your own identity, you bring your own language as well, because naturally you have to speak Latin in order to enter into to make career in the Roman state or in the Roman army. But nobody cares what you look like, nobody cares what you dress like, as long as you don't pray gods that are considered to be let's say subversive to the civil order, you're fine with that. Also here, baby, people like to stress this very much today, also for political reasons, but there was some discrimination in the Roman world, also based on look and so on. So don't buy into this. Maybe I will make a video in here. But the important here is that the glory of the Romans had been about saying we are able to bring all these peoples in. I mean, the objective was not to transform these populations into Romans proper. The Romans were content just to transform into Romans those who had to work for them, or better, to co-opt them, as it had happened for the Celtic aristocracies. For the rest, they didn't care. They were extremely pragmatic. But at this point in history, especially towards late Roman Empire, this concept was revived also in the sense that the imperial authority, that now also was a Christian authority, had to protect the whole community, the whole Christianity. And since, by the way, part of these local identities had gone lost, or they had been they had blended in, they had transformed quite radically, there was a sort of homogenization of the local, of the let's say of the Roman subjects as such. However, also this decentralization was still pretty much felt. So for the Bacaude to ask for help to the Roman authority was also a way to stress to recognize, of course, the same authority of the empire, and to accept that it was essentially necessary for the preservation of peace. So it's not that the Bacaude had any political project of greater scale. In fact, they kind of finished at one point. These weren't a people as such. This was mostly a socio-economical phenomenon, as I was saying before, and there was no other way that this Bacaude could become something greater. Because, by the way, all over the empire, even if you take North Africa, for instance, there were similar episodes like this. I mean, of local communities, especially from the countryside, that started to rebel, started to carry out brigandage and stuff like that. So the this happened in many ways. It was more than else the symptom of the collapse of certain institutions. In this case, in the 5th century, Roman Gaul was this was pretty evident, because at a certain point the Romans are not able to stem anymore the pressure. The Germanic populations, they're kind of obliged to not even to let them in, but just to watch them pouring in, and at that point just asking them to accept the Roman, formally the Roman authority as federati, or at least this kind of allies proper, because obviously the Romans considered these populations as future subjects, while these populations consider themselves as equal interlocutors at that point. So into Roman Gaul, this probably made a lot of impression, because it was a region, it was also intensely Romanized by this point, and this situation was seen the more dramatic, whereas if you inhabited at the outskirts of the empire, you were kind of even unused in part to such events. The Bacaude were in the middle in this sense, because they were partly within the orbit of this Gallic world that, by the way, was kind of growing increasingly, especially towards the later Roman Empire, as something on its own. At the same time, they were kind of also used at the idea that, you know, upheavals could take place, and given their lifestyle, their general living conditions, that were also kind of more used than other more Romanized populations to, I don't know, to take arms once again, to get into this risky business that was definitely eventually punished in many ways. So in other episodes, like that happened rather from this last example, and in other areas of Gaul, but also in the Iberian Peninsula, there was never such a meeting of the Bacaude and the Roman institutions. In the case of Armonica, probably there was a larger society. There was also more compact in its, and that probably corresponded more to a local identity on a provincial scale. In the other regions of Gaul and Iberia, this didn't really go like that. So in the case of Armonica, this community could ask to be represented in front of the Roman authority. In the others, there wasn't, and on the contrary, while in the episode of Armorica was actually listened by the Roman authorities, chiefly the church, that now was kind of growing as the facto the greater authority, at least at a local base. In these other cases, the church, the landowners, and also the Germanic invaders, telling the truth, came together in order to reestablish order and to annihilate the Bacaude. This is very interesting because it proves that most of these Bacaude were actually, at least in the eyes of the institutions, like simple brigands. And this is not surprising, by the way, because the same term brigand had been created by the Romans in this sense, because of the people of the Brigantes that lived into Britannia in 1st century AD, and that was settled around the city of Eburacum, today's York, and that the Romans considered as extremely warlike, because in fact they were. The Brigantes were settled in this area of Britain that was in fact not intensely Romanized. It was mostly the southeast of Britain that was more Romanized. These other populations were often not. In fact, that was York was a pretty much militarized center, because there were the legions in there that kind of stationed into into this area that had to be kept under control, at least into surrounding areas that in the nearbys where the Roman legions could intervene more often. So what I find particularly interesting is that, especially in this region of Gaul, but also I think perhaps in Iberia, the same Germanic populations, the same Germanic peoples that had invaded these Roman territories began to cooperate with the local Romanized elites to crush the Bacaude Revolts, because these were seen as something subversive and basically nothing more than bands of marauders, of criminals, and generally speaking, I'm quite positive towards every kind of attempt to not to create disorder. I mean, surely there are situations in which you have no many options but to take arms, but if you look at what happens when great empires crumble, it happens all the time. So there are bands of pirates, of marauders, of brigands, of other people that eventually pop out and start to to exploit this situation of chaos, essentially to commit the worst atrocities because for their own benefit. So I don't mind the heroic and pure romantic picture the Bacaude as poorly oppressed people who just searched for a better world. Most of them were probably scumbags, and although this is not to be this has not to be absolutized in as well, as surely some of these populations were definitely hard pressed by many factors that kind of didn't leave them many other choices. And it's a remarkable, in fact, the case of Armorica, because in there you find a positive collaboration, a mediation, an attempt to find a solution together, which is a proof of of civilization, let's say, and not just going out there raiding, destroying, and so on. Even if indeed we have to think that the life was much tougher at the time, and sometimes you had not much of an option. So let's say just that it's better to be objective, try to be objective with these things, and not to paint these guys in, say, good and evil terms, but just trying to understand from all sides what the causes for these phenomena actually were, which is very difficult, unfortunately, because we don't have any great evidence of the reasons, of the dynamics that broke to this. So passing from a strictly more political and social perspective, say that from the 5th century, the western half of the Roman Empire saw the major expansion of the so-called Romano Germanic monarchies. So this was a very complex political and institutional process that we will deal with on another occasion. I repeat that if you want, in the Migration Era playlist there is enough of these topics being discussed already, so if you're curious you can look at that. So this process was very important because it was actually mediated and formally recognized by the same Roman emperor. So as you know, after the end of the 5th century, also the only Roman emperor was the one of Constantinople, as the one of the West had been deposed. At least there had been some other authorities that even after 476 were still out there, but practically they didn't have any more the control over this thing. And even when the Western emperors were still there, the settlement of the Germanic populations, especially in areas like Gaul, were essentially accepted. So the hope was to everybody was winning from that, because at that point the Romans didn't have the strength to recover, especially in northern Gaul, all the lands that were seized by the Germans. Actually, the Western Roman Empire, contrarily wise to this commonly believed, was still pretty much capable of reconquering large areas of the empire. See the campaign of I don't know how you say that in the Majoran or Majoranus, I don't know how you say. And I don't understand why this damn thing doesn't work. Majorianus, so this was really no, Majoranus actually as well in Latin, so I was right, but yeah, whatever. On that occasion, I'm just talking about him because the example is very important. He managed to eventually curb most of Spain. I mean, if he hadn't been defeated by the Vandals that were actually interfering with the same Spain at that point, it means that the Western Empire was at that point only based on Italy and a few other surrounding areas, was still capable of retaking even such a large place like Spain. And this should make us reflect on how the Germanic populations that had settled into the West were in no better conditions than what the Western Roman Empire was. And the proof is there in Spain that when Majoranus arrived, basically the Visigoths, raised hands and said, "Okay, we're done. Do whatever you want with us. We come back being federati essentially, and we do whatever you want." But because they also, the problem of these Germanic populations was mostly a demographical one. These were a few tens of thousands actually, and by that time, especially with the demic contraction, it wasn't really a few, but at the same time it was a number that could be, wiped out through a battle. And there were populations that had been wiped out in such a fashion and resettled, scattered somewhere else by the Roman authorities. So at this point, however, especially in northern Gaul, it was impossible for the Western Roman Empire to launch these long-range invasions. It was actually a problem with resources. So at this point, the Romans said, "Okay, given that now those populations are settled there, we can't move them anymore. At least in the short term, let's grant them this settlement, formally speaking, through our imperial authority, so that they feel obliged to us for this, and we can also make things like trade work and all this stuff." So these Germanic populations definitely accepted, not because they liked to be Roman allies, they essentially wanted to be left on their own, but they understood, at least the more enlightened fringe of their aristocracies understood, that if the bonding with the Romans was definitely an extremely advantageous deal, because this equated, first of all, to have a formal recognition of their authority on those lands, to be, in this sense, also more accepted by the local communities, and third, also to have a very powerful ally, because it doesn't matter how the empire was in trouble at this point, it was still a huge military force altogether. And especially even when the Western Roman Empire fell, Constantinople was perceived as this superpower in Europe and in the Mediterranean. So even if objectively the Byzantines at that point didn't have the resources to reconquer the whole Western Empire, definitely you see that even under the time of Justinian, that Italy was reconquered, Africa was reconquered, southern Spain was reconquered. So there was this huge power was still technically capable of representing a threat. And recently I concentrated especially on this in the last videos. Just a couple of days ago I made a video that is the emergence of the Western Empire, balance between Franks, Byzantines and Islam. That is something that now happened a bit later, but deals also with the previous relations between the Franks and the Byzantines, or also previously the Western Roman Empire, to see how this broader continental scenario was thought, strategically speaking, also in the chances of expanding on certain regional theaters, because the Romans were feared always by the Germans. It wasn't like another video was the one 6th century balance of power, Goths versus Franks in Constantinople, which also deals pretty much in detail with this. So all considerations that more or less we've already been talking about on Schwerpunkt, but that are kind of useful to remind. What is important about this process is that even during under the Germanic rule, actually the Roman administration kept working for a while, especially the old municipal organizations of the Roman cities kept to go on. Firstly, because the late antique culture up to at least the plague of the 6th century had kind of remained essentially alive, in spite of the contraction, of the decline, etc. But in the essentials it was still standing. And also in here there were more or less traumatic passages. I mean, I always say this, for instance, in Gaul there was no moment of break between late antique world and early medieval times. It was a very progressive transformation. In other countries, like Italy especially, where that model was arguably more alive, at least for Western standards, in there was this terrible destruction with the Gothic War, and eventually the Longobards were reshaped, the peninsula, on a completely different base. So in there, this change was more felt. But generally speaking, and not even in Italy that completely disappeared. I mean, the cities in Gaul into Italy kept working at this time. The Germans were not coming from a urbanized world, because cities did not exist in the so-called Barbaricum. So that when the Germans arrived into places like Gaul, in fact, they started to say, well, okay, but what these guys have here is pretty amazing. I mean, the Germans obviously didn't have a urban society, but they still knew that in the Roman Empire things worked like that, and they were quite attracted by it. So they did their best actually to preserve the Roman civilization, which is something that is often overlooked. Naturally, this was also transforming by itself, but the idea is that as long as there are cities that work, it's better to let them work. And especially with the Franks, you see that the Merovingian power was able to rise thanks to the alliance with the local church, with the local bishops that in Gaul, in fact, were all essentially city governors. As Gaul had is dotted with all these many Roman cities that also had a Celtic origin as pre-urban centers, let's say, that around which the Roman domination had revolved essentially. However, also in here, the economy and the social organization went steadily declining, especially into the 6th century. As we have seen in the in the Mediterranean regions, and especially into Italy, the effects of the wars had been more devastating. In Gaul, really not. But also in here there is a contraction that, by the way, corresponds also to the decline of the Merovingian power. It was mostly structural. You realize that, especially with the plague, that there were no resources anymore. I mean, economic, endemic resources were brutally contracting. So this brought as a consequence first of all the population of the cities, even if not their death. I mean, it's especially in Northern Europe, in places like Britain or other regions around Germany, and even Northern Gaul in part. Yes, certain cities were abandoned, but also in here it's never a full abandonment. I mean, the Roman infrastructures had kind of worked up to a certain point. They were still standing. The settlement of human communities was always kind of revolving around these Roman infrastructures in a way or another. Another important change, paradoxically, was, from a social point of view, the disappearance of the serfdom as of slavery. Let's say serfdom remained, but classical slavery kind of progressively disappeared, which is very difficult to make as a point, because even up to Carolingian times there were de facto slaves or so. But sometimes it's difficult to tell, what's the difference between a serf and a slave. Because even slaves in ancient Rome, I mean, there was, I don't know, the slave that worked into the Roman latifundia was like staying, I don't know, in a concentration camp. These guys were used as, essentially as tools of instruments, I don't know. And they were thought as objects. The highly educated slave that lived at the imperial court was someone who was extremely prized, that had a very high quality of life, and it's obvious that the majority of slaves were like in the first case, not in the second. But also here, in late antique and in early medieval times, this difference was pretty varied sometimes. Christianity brought in the idea that slavery was essentially wrong, because every human had to be free, as all humans were equal. This was the main thing. I mean, it's not that Christianity pushed enormously or immediately for this end of slavery, but it brought in these thoughts that were already known in the ancient world but were now strongly revived. This idea that you can't make another fellow human being a slave of your own, because you're all equal in the face of God. And here, more than ideal or cultural, let's say, perceptions, it was rather the flattening also of society that brought to this. Because from one side, it is true, there were certain regions where actually social stratification increased. But we can say that when, especially the Roman latifundium collapsed even as a social model, telling the truth, it's obvious that, and especially with the injection of Germanic elements into society that had a very egalitarian mindset, at least for what concerned the idea of freemen, and of course they also had slaves or serfs, as you want to call them, there was the idea that was the preferred model. After all, it happened many times into the late antique that there were these social instances that brought to revolts. We've seen the Bacaude that did something similar. Or for instance, during the Gothic War into Italy, at a certain point the Goths that were fighting against the Byzantines that were reconquering the peninsula began to essentially to free the Roman slaves, the Roman colonists because they were essentially promising them freedom in the case they had won against the Byzantines, who instead wanted to essentially maintain intact the latifundium system into the Apennine Peninsula once they would have been reconquered, so that the Goths in that case were promising to the Italic populations the full integration into the Germanic model. And in fact, when the Longobards arrived and the war had wiped out the Roman latifundia, indeed the Italian society transformed into something extremely similar to the Germanic one, in the sense that there was a very high per capita wealth that, for instance, you don't find in Gaul, because Gaul at that point was probably much richer, but the society in there had remained more like the Roman one, in terms of the latifundium, of the huge wealth in the hands of a few people, and with social stratification with many other peasants of colonists or serfs that worked into the lands. And now we'll see how this practically happened. So the servitus, however, so this slavery in the classical sense, kind of declined in part. This process happened also for another reason, that is, the Romans had a lot of slaves back in the day when the empire was still expanding. When the empire overstretched, and essentially from the 2nd century there were no major let's say wars of expansion, and there were ways also in Roman law for which slaves could be freed, for instance. So progressively, and also with the impoverishment of the middle classes, kind of the slaves kind of in part were freed, in part the middle classes became kind of poorer. So even what was the slave now? I mean, how many slaves were there? This was contracting. Naturally, there were still many people who worked into the estates, etc., but now were often not slaves, but colonists. So that means actually freemen by law. The colonist back in the day, into early Roman times, was actually a very well-off figure, because the colonist in the Roman society was the guy who was the Roman citizen who was sent usually to inhabit these new lands that were conquered, and that enjoyed certain privileges because he usually lived in a colony. In fact, it was a Roman city, and that was essentially encouraged and incentivized to grow as a city, because the Romans wanted to Romanize those new lands. At this point, the colonist instead was a much worse condition. It was essentially a serf, a peasant who who worked for someone in the latifundio. So between the late antique and the early medieval times, albeit the personal freedom of a colonist was actually never put into discussion, the colonist became increasingly tied to the land where he was working. So it is obvious that there was no legal reason to say, okay, this colonist now is not a freeman anymore, because the Roman Empire has stratified and has kind of dominated by oligarchies as it was, and never was also still in the European kind of tribal society. Tribes were actually Roman assemblies, and the idea was that the freeman was the freeman. I mean, the Romans were not like other Eastern powers where there was a kind of demigod emperor, and the others were all kind of had to be subjected to him. The Romans, especially in the western half of the empire, had always remained with this mentality that every Roman citizen was a freeman, and that he was born as such. So there was no institutional, juridical reason for, at this time saying, okay, you're not a free man anymore. But definitely the living conditions had transformed into a fashion that these guys were essentially conceived as such. We've seen it with Diocletian. Was the system of the essentially of the routing of the colonists on a certain land. So this was definitely a great fall into, shrinking into the individual freedom of action, so that you had to work essentially where your father had been working. You couldn't evade from that. It was a state that controlled you. You had to pay the taxes to. You had to go into the military service, and there was no way you could. The early Roman Empire was very different. Even the same army was mostly voluntary. People were freer to move to there was a lighter state essentially. At this point, instead, you were framed, wherever you were, by the way. So even the wealthy guys at the top were kind of condemned to remain in those roles. So society was crystallizing, and it was crystallizing also by itself. So it's not that Diocletian or Constantine kind of forced for it. They kind of understood that that was the only way for making things work better. And arguably they were right, because eventually what was created at that point, at least for the Eastern Roman Empire, functioned in order to survive eventually for more than a millennium again. So it wasn't in the West, and this could be maybe related, in fact, to this more to the fact that the Western Europe had remained kind of more tribal in nature, so that there was a less degree of centralization. In the Eastern world, as we've seen, the local populations were used kind of from millennia with, pharaohs and kings of kings and Hellenistic rulers of sort to say, okay, we're under someone. There were also many more resources in there. The Western Europe was much more tribal, much wilder. Even the same Romans had emerged from a kind of very tribal mindset on their own. So on the long run, as long as the empire had energies, the West kind of, this is an interpretation, kind of could be controlled by a state. We could deploy legions in there. When these resources kind of began to shrink and to be exhausted, the grip over these populations simply came to an end, and it was kind of normal to happen. So this is also an interpretation you can make from a social point of view why the Roman Empire in the West, let's say, fell. Because if you really look at it, it wasn't really destroyed. It simply melted apart. That is something different. And naturally, there are other interpretations, because of course, if these Germanic populations had not arrived, definitely the Western Empire would have survived in some way, or maybe it would have been reunified into a unique Roman Empire. So obviously, I'm stressing certain interpretations to make certain points, but you're clever enough to understand that there are other options. So what is that I was saying? Oh, yeah. So the colonists at this point was increasingly demanded for, essentially, for mandatory and unrewarded services. Does it remind you of anything? The medieval corvée actually arguably began from now. So in this sense, there is nothing medieval. This was a normal thing. I mean, if you have enough contractual power as a landowner, you can oblige your colonists also to this kind of exactions. And this is why, you understand why the Bacaude were not so happy, because maybe they didn't want even these things, because everybody was behaving bad at that time. Let's be honest about it. It was a world where justice was very remotely applied, where things were very much where the stronger kind of had the upper hand, of course. Yet there was a social order of some sort. Also, this was not all bad. So other negative things, let's say, is that obviously his services were decided most of the times just by the landowner, so that he didn't bother even himself to ask the colonists if they were fine with that, because he could afford such an imposition. The colonists were, this is also an important thing, they were kind of obliged to buy products or to use infrastructures within the dominus villa, within the patron's villa. And he had in part a juridical dependence from the landowner, from the patron, because the empire at this point had been parceled in all many little in this very hierarchical frame of the dioceses, the provinces, and then the local districts, and these amounts of land that, according to the capitatio iugatio system, had to provide each own a certain amount of resources of sort, even records for the army, etc. So you couldn't really go wherever you wanted. You were kind of juridically tied to the land you stayed in, and the state knew that, and the local authorities knew it, so you were kind of controlled in this sense. And by the way, there was not much you could do, also because by those times you were lucky if you already had a place to stay in, to work in. It doesn't matter how harsh it was, because the alternative was death, arguably. Because of all the barbarian incursions and all these Bacaude rebellions, etc., also the countrysides had begun to be pretty dangerous. So this escape from freedom, paradoxically, was increasing, because the chances of living a safe life were higher into the latifundia, as these were guarded by armed so-called vigilantes or vigilantes. This time in the late empire, probably the ecclesiastical pronunciation of what we call ecclesiastical pronunciation had kicked in, so vigilantes is better. But so there were guardians that were armed, and also because the great landowners were the large estates owners were also usually pretty wealthy people. They had military retinues, and sometimes they were the same guys who, after all, ruled in the cities, so who had also the control of the urban militias and so on. There were other kind of other dynamics. For instance, this increasing control of the families that lived on the estates, so these colonists, allowed a more rational organization from the top in terms of production. So back in early Roman times, the great estates had usually been characterized by a let's say a monoculture regime. Usually either wheat, grapes, olives as products, etc. At this point, the parcelization of the lands and the assignation of these say the parcelization and assignation of these lands to different families, which substituted the slaves, brought to a diversification of the production, because naturally the families that they had naturally to produce a certain amount of goods, but are kind of more autonomous than what the slaves had been. This transition had happened also because, if in early Roman times, trade was kind of easier, and that there was a greater international trade. So the more, I mean, this monoculture regime was functional to say, okay, we know that, I don't know, in the East somewhere they buy en masse our wheat, so we're gonna specialize only in wheat. And so they made all the slaves working in the wheat. Now the trade had contracted, so much of the of what was consumed now was actually functional for a much shorter range trade. I mean, what am I saying? I mean that this production was more functional to the local society. And it was also more mindful in the sense that probably in the past the products had gone more wasted in part, as in greater systems it always happens, so that the greater landowners simply said, okay, well, I care just to make a big lot of money, and now I don't care to refine my own, I mean, to diversify my cultures, for instance, because I'm sure I'm gonna make a lot of money just with the old system. So this is a bit the stagnation factor of the latifundium, for which in part the same Roman economy had collapsed. Now, with economical crisis, there is a greater diversification, because you want really to produce what is needed and to really save as many resources as possible, knowing that your products are going to go exactly consumed in that measure, in that market, etc. So paradoxically, with the decline of agricultural production, there is also an increasing specialization and probably also higher refinement of the production and agricultural systems in some part, at least a diversification. But let's say that this happened also in other fields, also in the military, that the late Roman Empire is not at all a moment of decline, of stagnation, of things like technology. On the contrary, because it's exactly when the crisis kicked in that this world that had always been fine economically speaking, for the first time after centuries, is more interested in investing into technology, because he knows that through that there is more, let's say, more profits that can be obtained in absolute terms. So at this point, by the way, the production, the local production was normally meant, I mean, the goods were meant to circulate within the same villa, essentially. So naturally, economical potential was pretty low, so the surplus was usually a few, so this food was consumed essentially within the same estate that was starting to work a bit like a monad. There is at so many levels now, also if you think about the religious experiences that were taking place at this time with monasticism and all, that there is the idea of the enclosure, of the idea of the place that is kind of detached from the world, not anymore in the city but in the countryside, trying to work with the trying to essentially produce what you really need and to work on your own, so to be dependent, there's also a great psychological need of this after all the destructions, all the wars, all the epidemics, to be in peace sometime. There is a real elaboration of also the same concept of the Roman otium that now is intended also from a religious point of view, so that this retirement from the world was also meant in spiritual terms. And there are also these various experiences of communities that were essentially producing food just for their own, and not only because of these things, but also because there was objectively an economical crisis, so that when there was enough surplus to be sold, it would still be sold, but it was something much rarer than in the past. the same Benedictine rule that is written in this time deals stresses the fact that the monks have not just to pray, but they also have to work the land, because that was the only way to survive, especially in the context where the Benedictine rule was written. So a country devastated by war, but epidemics, where it was very difficult even to survive, to find enough resources. So a real change in many ways. At this point there was also a great enlargement, even within the same estates, agricultural estates, of certain reserves. There was they were kept like either as forests or pastures, and this didn't happen just because of the demic contraction that unavoidably had brought the wilderness kind of re-expanding into Europe after Roman times, but also because there were new colonists that came from the Germanic world that were there was renowningly very poor for agriculture, and that had been traditionally used at that point to mostly live of hunt and of gathering and of livestock, and they used to eat, by the way, much more proteins and fats than what was happening within the Roman peasants that were mostly eating cereals. So arguably there was also, in part, this is a very debated topic, bettering in the nutrition at this time, because and you see it this also at every level, also in geography, etc. There is nutrition was very important, and that the Germanic world kind of brought in more, even animals like pigs, like cows, this idea of protein, of fats with cheese and all. So these Germanic populations brought with them, they were semi-nomadic initially, they brought with them lots of herds, for instance, of sheeps, of other definitely other animals, other herds of animals that could provide meat and milk. And what is interesting about this is that this process was channeled also, where it was possible, into the local production system, so that it's not a magically, in the early medieval times there were just bands of freemen scattered somewhere that went populating the populated areas, and everything restarted from scratch. There were still, in fact, as we have seen, farms and latifundia, etc. And you see that all these products were integrated and sometimes also exported when the surplus was enough. That the rare times would this happen, but at this time, but definitely it was still possible, and it was still trade. For many reasons. First of all, it was very difficult for a single estate to produce really every single product, every single type of food, and to be completely self-sufficient. So an exchange between all these farms was necessary, and especially at the short range, the traffics kept going on. But even on the long range, there were luxury products and other, let's say, artists, let's say, handcrafted products that were sold. So international traffic really never stopped. There was never something like that, like Pirenne said. And it was a very strong contraction, but the flux still existed. Animals were particularly useful also for certain materials that could be produced. So it wasn't just about having dairy products and milk, cheese, meat, etc. It was also a matter, for instance, of producing certain objects. If you ever thought about it, and you see this in paleography, is that in the West, at this point, the papyrus starts to be rarer because the contacts with the East were much less. So now there was a need for other material supports to write, and parchment, so the vellum, was used. So animals were needed. Also, you know, a medieval manuscript made of parchment required to slaughter, or I don't know how many hundreds of sheep or other animals to produce actually the pages. So, by the way, just think about how much manuscripts were precious at that time. So it's remarkable, by the way, and for all those people who think that medieval times were an age of darkness where people were not interested in culture and so on, what it meant for early medieval times to produce manuscripts and to share them and to read them. That gives you a dimension of how important was culture at the time, how important knowledge was, highly was knowledge regarded, even at that time. So this, by the way, entailed that in order to produce this material, there were also other crafts associated. For instance, tanners that had to work the parchment, and other small activities, even for building, I don't know, the agricultural tools and stuff like that. They were so precious for surviving, in fact. So it's evident that at this moment, especially during the 5th century, the Western society underwent a great ruralization. It was mostly an economical process that, as we have seen, went in parallel with the depopulation of cities, and had to do also with issues of social security, because the cities were kind of the target of the barbarian raids and devastation. So living in the countryside was also a way to escape, and this also because of the lack of strong powers, because cities now couldn't be guarded effectively by where were the Roman legions. The Roman legions at a certain point withdraw. Think about Britain. At a certain point, the Romans say, okay, bye. So there was, society had to re-equilibrate itself on different bases. There was a lot of inflation as well. That was striking the middle classes that had been the ones that had been kind of the sap of the Roman economy in earlier times, in order to make trade work and to produce also the bulk of the, for instance, all these middle, small and middle properties had been granted a certain dynamism of Roman economy back in the day. Now this class disappears, and society has to readapt, economically speaking, accordingly. In Italy and in southern Gaul, definitely the cities declined less than other western regions. But if you look at the general tendency of western provinces, it basically the decline happened pretty much everywhere as a trend. And as we were saying before, there was also together with the endemic contraction and the process of ruralization, several agricultural areas were abandoned, especially the ones that belonged to the state once, because these had been raided more easily, let's say, or at least there were large areas that at this point were during the Roman Empire, as long as there hadn't been major invasions, certain lands had been exploited because they were safe. Now, part of these were not safe anymore. They had been devastated, they had been depopulated. So this also brought the need to go work elsewhere, to produce elsewhere. And while these other areas transformed themselves in basically in the wilderness, to fallow land and cultivated land. So at this point, certain of these public lands were bought by the great landowners or colonized by free peasants, while another part of that came to be once again like swamps or forests. And forests were growing also in importance for the for evident reasons, as timber was extremely important for also rebuilding, as stone and also the great spin-off that existed around it had collapsed. So now the needs were more modest, were often the needs of smaller political entities than what the Roman Empire had been. So timber was pretty much used in rebuilding early medieval Europe. By the way, woods were the forests were extremely important for the livestock. And the pig at this point becomes a crucial animal. That was extremely important, and the pig had always been important, arguably, into Western economy. In the video I was making on the Celtic totemic animals, you see how in Gaul, into Italy, the pig or the wild boar was extremely widespread as a symbol. It had also many religious meanings attached, as especially this, because of his relation with the woods, with the food that came from the oaks, were considered sacred, and that it was used to feed the pig. So at this point, the Germans also had this kind of feeling with them. And if you look at the Germanic laws into Western Europe, you find that all over the West there was a huge importance and increase of pig breeding, and that the pig really provided a huge amount of resources for feeding, etc. So as we were saying before, the Italic and Southern Gallic cities didn't decline all at once. And they kind of tended to remain more alive. They were usually ruled by certain functionaries, the decurions, that were traditionally in charge of many aspects of the urban life, including the collection of taxes, the emanation of the public acts, also the upkeeping, the maintenance of the infrastructures. The Roman cities had arguably always worked in this way. I mean, it was the local aristocracies that really paid for the majority of the public work in the Roman Empire. These were mostly aristocrats that had a lot of that through this received public offices. They made money out of them. They enlarged their clienteles. So at this time, these were the same more or less at least, the same people that existed before, but the only difference that many of them now were kind of abandoning the cities. So the Roman government had entrusted to these decurions and other figures the management of the city for what could be still saved of them. And this was very important to grant a bit more of social order in these highly tormented times, albeit, as we've said before, it was normally the church at this point. It was taking care of the public administration, especially in these areas, and becoming de facto even the most important, the strongest power within the city walls. And I'm talking not just about a moral authority, I'm talking also about military retinues and so on. So these decurions were also pretty well off. Usually they came from, in fact, the cream of society, and especially in the West this was much felt because there was a bit of more of a continuity with the senatorial families in these offices than what it was happening in the East, because in the Eastern Roman Empire it was a more meritocratic system. But objectively also in the West, these Roman senators were kind of the best individuals for such tasks. They were the more educated, they were some of the best educated people. They already had enough money to keep investing where it was needed. So and they felt very much this prestige, and eventually, even when the Western Roman Empire fell, you realize that these cities, especially, I don't know, into Italy, into southern Gaul, etc., were developing a kind of a great municipal pride, which was expressed by these aristocratic families, who also were very proud of still managing the affairs within the city. They produce a very interesting epigraphy that stressed the importance of the local city. I think especially in a world where the city was declining so much. So sometimes, for the medieval times, even just a walled town was an amazing settlement, and the people who lived within them were extremely proud of that. And these cities, especially in these regions of southern Europe, kind of survived straight into medieval times. There was no discontinuity. There were definitely transformations. Also, the populations within the city walls kind of shifted location. They went settling in other areas of the center. Within the same city walls, think about Rome, how many forests and there were now that were spreading, so certain areas even within the same city walls were abandoned. But life continued within them. These curial officers sometimes also made fortune and managed to enter into the Senate if they weren't already part of a senatorial family. And by the 5th century, what is interesting here is that the access to this career was not based anymore on, let's say, a kind of socio-ethnical origin, but it was open a bit to everyone who had enough money. So it was on a sensual base. So the old senatorial families were still in charge up to which at the moment, at least, in which they weren't wiped out by a certain reason. And in Gaul this don't happen, so they continued and they kind of blended with the Germanic resources. And naturally, you can imagine of how clientelism worked at this point. There was a lot of favoritisms, a lot of very private business, and this contributed, especially in those areas where, in fact, the as we've just said, into Gaul, where these aristocracies did not disappear, to the to the increase of the concept of privatization. So what was public before now was becoming personal, and this is partly how the same medieval feudalism finds its origins in, as we have seen. If you look at the video made on the Frankish Commendatio, that's the point I'm making. You know, and not only I am making, of course, that the vassalitic beneficiary system that was in use, was developed by the Carolingians, had its roots exactly into this Gallo-Roman society, and and it was a hybrid together with the Germanic clienteles. All the word at this point was clienterly, but there is definitely a contrast between the kind of more the strong sense of public that existed into Roman times and the progressive privatization that started occurring this time. So the idea also of being a lord, a dominus, a patron, corresponded not just to being, the head of some slaves or clients that gravitated around you, just like that. It really meant to have a lordship over a lots of lands, a lot of even of cities, and stressing in a world that has a very weak central authority, essentially that you are at the top of society in every sense. So maybe it's better if I stop here. So I think we managed to say everything I needed, and I just hope we will keep talking about this. It's not over, definitely. It's important to discuss it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe. Well, I said this again. Sorry, I was looking at another thing now. I was got confused. However, for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.